What is up, everybody? Thank you for coming back. I hope you had a great Thanksgiving. I know that I did. And I'm really eager to get back into our study of Colossians. Today, we're going to be in verses 15 through 17. So let's dive on in. All right, guys, like I said, today we're going to be in verses 15 through 17 of chapter 1, and this traditionally is known as a Christ hymn. Paul does this in various writings where he exalts Christ, and like we said before, here Paul is talking with a heavy Jewish, Greek, and Roman society. So they had a very muddled view of who Jesus was. So here, what Paul is going to do is exalt Christ and show them who he truly is. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So right here, what Paul is doing is tackling the Jewish and pagan faith by showing them who Jesus truly is. Jesus is the image of the invisible God. So what we're going to do first is go to John 1, verses 1 through 3. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. So what you see is Paul is doing the same thing that John is doing, except John is using the word logos and Paul is using the word icon, but it's the same thing. It's the representation of God. Christ is the perfect representation of God. You also see that in John, you see that Christ is related to God. You also see that he's called the beginning, and seeing how all things are held together in him and through him. So when you read Paul, you also see a lot of John's teaching and the same teaching of the deity of Christ, which ultimately leads the readers back to Genesis 1. And so next, Paul takes on the pagan gods by calling Christ the image of the invisible God. You see, Paul does the same argument in Acts 17 when he goes to the Areopagus and he discusses with the Greeks and the Romans and the thinkers in Acts 17 verses 23 through 28. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made of one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God in the hope that they might feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as one of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. So as we see, the reason I wanted to bring up Acts 17 is because Paul uses the same argument. He calls God in Acts 17 the unknown God. And then he calls God here in Colossians the unseen God. And so he's saying the same thing. This God made the world and everything in it. This God is the Lord of heaven and earth. This God created all mankind. And so this is even referencing again back to Genesis and Jesus, and saying Jesus is God. He is the creator of all things, and he is the sustainer of all things. He holds all things together. And Paul does this in this passage. So let's continue, because next he's going to go off a little bit more by calling Christ the firstborn. See, the firstborn is a really big thing. And especially when you understand kingdoms and Jewish culture, the firstborn means the heir, that he is the heir of all the inheritance of what's going on. So here he's saying he's the heir of creation. John said the same thing in 1 John 3, where he says that there was not anything made that was not made through him. So he is the substance of all things. Now, to kind of explain that, I want to give a human metaphor. It's not going to be great, but it's gonna try to give you a better view of what I mean by the firstborn. You see, A kingdom will not begin, nor will it remain without the firstborn. To trace the kingdom back to a direct king, that king can only be called a kingdom because of his firstborn, in whom he would leave all of the kingdom to. But that's where our analogy fails. You see, God did not need a firstborn, but out of his loving kindness, Christ became the firstborn for us to redeem that in which Satan tried to destroy. So, God the Father made a covenant with God the Son to restore earth to its proper domain with the power of God the Spirit. Thus, mankind is only a recipient of what Paul calls grace. So, Christ being the firstborn means he is the heir of all creation, the rightful king of creation. And that's why Paul says in Christ we have an inheritance, because not only is he the creator, but he's also the king. And he's given this to us. And he says, here, guys, you have this inheritance. Why? Because he is the firstborn and all things belong to him. And Paul emphasizes that in the next verse where he says, for by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. So in the beginning where he says in heaven and on earth, that's just, again, Paul saying he is the God of creation. Christ is the God of creation. This is who he is. Worship him as that. But then when he says visible and invisible, that's when we get into the spiritual stuff. You see, in the first part, Paul is talking about creation and how Christ is the king of creation. But in the second part, he says, whether thrones or dominions, rulers or authorities. Here, Paul is speaking of the non-physical creation. So in the first part, he's speaking of the physical creation. And then the second part, he's speaking of the non-physical creation. And so many theologians want to take this as angels and those of the spiritual realm, showing how Christ is the Lord of even angels and demons. And you see that a lot when he's on earth, how he rebukes the demons. But even I love how in Hebrews verses 5-8 of chapter 1, it shows how Christ is receiving reverence from the angels. For to which of his angels did God ever say, you are my son, today I have begotten you? Or again, I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. And again, he brings the firstborn into the world and says, let all God's angels worship him. Again, you hear that firstborn language, and he is getting reverence and worship from the angels. This is showing that Christ is the king of not just humans, but also the non-humans, the spiritual realm. And where it says all things were created through him and for him, it kind of ties into the beginning of verse 16 where it says, for by him all things were created. It shows us that Christ is the instrument of creation. He is the purpose of creation, and he is also the basis of creation. Christ is involved in all things. And lastly, he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. I wanted to quote one of my favorite theologians, John Calvin, on this one because he said it way better than I could. All things were created by him and for him. He places angels in subjection to Christ, that they may not obscure his glory, for 4 seasons. In the first place, because they were created by him. Secondly, because their creation ought to be viewed as having relation to him, as their legitimate end. Thirdly, because he himself existed always prior to their creation. Fourthly, he does not affirm this merely as to angels, but also to the whole world. Thus, he places the Son of God in the highest seat of honor, that he may have preeminence over all angels as well as men, and may bring under control all creation in heaven and on earth. And so, with this, you see how Paul just jam-packed a whole lot of theology in just 3 verses. And so there's so much more that we can talk about. There's so much more that we can unpack here, but I'm going to leave it at that because that's a good place to stop. What this ought to do to our hearts is cause us to worship. So we just learned the theology of the text, what Paul meant, but this should cause our heart to worship. It should create a doxological response. It should make us want to praise and worship God, maybe not by voice or maybe not by instruments, but man, maybe through your talent, maybe through the things you do, maybe just go run outside and like flow your arms in the air and enjoy, because we live in a world where Christ is king. We don't have to worry about what's going to happen if the president isn't elected, or we don't have to worry about if there's a war coming, or we don't have to worry about if a comet's going to hit the earth, because we have the King of creation holding us in the palm of his hand. And that should cause us to worship. But not only that, what do we do now, right? Like, what is the practical application of this? And honestly, I would say it is to live under the rule and reign of Jesus, where grace and joy abound. So let's leave with that, right? Now that we learn that Christ is the King of creation, he is the King of all things hold together. There is not anything that does not exist without Jesus. So let's go and act like that. Let's go live and befriend people. Let's go share the gospel. Let's go spread some joy, because this is the byproduct of living in the gospel, is joy. Right? That's what Paul says. We have this joy to cause our patience and our endurance and make us happy people around non-happy people. So let the text produce joy in you, and go and serve your King in that joy. Until next time, peace out.